Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event entitled You're PCI Compliant, but Are You Secure? Today's webinar is sponsored by Illumio and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator on today's event. I'm honored to introduce you to today's presenter, that is Vivian Taro, who is a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Illumio. Vivian, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. And good morning, good afternoon to all.
Excellent. Well, before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things here I need to cover about the event. So first off, we want this to be a very educational event. So we encourage you to ask all the questions you have about PCI compliance, microsegmentation, things like that. And we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event where we will do our best to answer all your questions. Second, in the handout tab there in your GoToWebinar control panel, you can download two different assets that we've uploaded. And the first one is a solutions brief entitled Meeting PCI Challenges with Adaptive Security. And the second one is a best practices guide on how to secure your crown jewel application. So I encourage you to check those out, share them with your friends and colleagues. And then third, some of you may have heard that we are awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event today. If you're watching this event on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. We will be doing that prize announcement at the end of today's webinar. You can optionally donate your prize value to one of our selected charities. Through our events, we've donated thousands of dollars to charity thanks to very generous attendees who have won prizes. So if you choose to do that, thank you in advance. The official prize terms and conditions for that prize drawing can be found at actualtechmedia.com. Scroll to the bottom and there you'll find the prize terms and conditions. And with that, let's review what you're going to learn on today's webinar. So we'll be talking about the common PCI errors that can introduce massive risk to your environment. You'll learn about strategies for using the MITRE attack framework and disrupting lateral movement. And then finally, how to align PCI compliance with your threat environment to enact both the letter and the spirit of PCI compliance. And with that, I'm excited to hand it over to Vivian. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, David. So good morning, everyone. So today's agenda will cover the following: the state of your PCI compliance today, understand your threat environment and your adversary by using the MITRE attack framework, disrupting lateral movement attack techniques, and microsegmentation with Illumio. So let's begin. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Verizon 2018 Payment Security Report. And according to this report, a lot more organizations are 100% compliant. PCI requires companies to not only be 100% compliant, but to also maintain it continuously. So there's this report called an IROC, or the Interim Report on Compliance, which measures the state of compliance and efficacy of PCI controls in between assessments. So IROC is a very good proxy for measuring the ability of organizations to maintain 100% PCI compliance states continuously. And if you look at this chart that I'm showing to you right now, you will note that from 2012 to 2017, there is an upward trend in terms of the percentage of organizations that are 100% compliant, although there is a slight dip, like close to 3% between 2017 to 2018. But overall, the trend is going up. Now, despite the positive trends in the state of PCI compliance, plus all investments in other programs like GDPR, we still continue to hear and read about these massive data breaches. So for example, you've heard about, the major retailers who was certified compliant 1 week before a bad actor actually installed malware inside their network, or the payment processor that was certified PCI compliant, but then for 6 consecutive years, but then they still suffered a data breach. So what I did is I also pulled together some interesting statistics from 2017 to 2018, which were published by well-known security researchers from Verizon, CrowdStrike, Security Metrics, to really underscore these macro trends that breaches still keep happening. So let's look at one of the stats on this list. So let's pick the one on the upper left, which shows that according to the Verizon 2018 Data Breach Investigations Report, there were 2,216 reported data breaches. Out of these, 78% were perpetrated by outside actors, 48% involved hacking, and 30% included malware. Now, in order to understand why these breaches continue to occur, it's also useful to look at the PCI requirements where breached companies consistently demonstrate the most deficiencies. PCI DSS has 12 core requirements, and according to Verizon's payment security report, these are the top 5 areas where breached companies are most deficient, and Verizon refers to these as the PCI troublemakers. There's more than 5, but I'm going to talk about the top 5. The first one is requirement 1, which is really around which covers the use of firewalls to filter traffic between internal and external networks, as well as lateral traffic inside the company network. The report found that 66.7% of the companies assessed after a breach were actually compliant with requirement 1. The next one is requirement 5. So this one covers protecting systems from malware, including viruses, worms, and Trojan. And the report finds that 55.6% of companies assessed after a breach were compliant with this requirement. The third one is around developing and maintaining secure systems. So this covers secure application development, hardening of applications, managing change. It also covers how systems and applications are developed and maintained, including those maintained and created by third parties. And they found that only 33.3% of organizations assessed after a breach were compliant with requirement 6. Fourth one is requirement 7, which covers restricting access to cardholder data on a need-to-know basis. So this particular requirement focuses on processes and controls to limit user access to the minimum that they need to perform their duties. And 55.6% of companies assessed after a breach were actually in compliance with requirement 7. And then to round up the top 5, it's requirement 10. And this one is really around tracking and monitoring access to network resources and cardholder data. And here they found that 11.1% of companies assessed after a breach were compliant with this requirement.
Vivian, I think we've got a poll question here I'd like to pop up for the audience.
Of course, please.
The poll question there on the screen, make sure you check it out. The question is, if you are PCI compliant, how confident are you that PCI compliance will protect your organization from a data breach? And the answer is there, not confident at all. So PCI compliance doesn't really make a difference to you. Somewhat confidence, meaning you think it helps, but compliance might not stop a determined intruder. You're confident, so you don't constantly worry about it, but not 100% sure. Very confident, meaning you sleep pretty well at night, knowing the chances of a breach are slim. And extremely confident, last answer there, PCI compliance covers all the bases. My organization is safe from breaches. So while you answer this, I'll share one scary statistic I heard yesterday, which was it takes about 180 days on average for an organization to realize that they have a breach at all, and then another 66 days to recover from that breach once they realize they have it. So it's scary that a lot of organizations might have a breach and not even know that they have one.
Yeah.
I think most of the audience looks like has voted on this. Let me go ahead and share the results with you, Vivian, and you can tell me.
I can't see the results right now. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Ooh,
so it looks like 46%. Yeah, 46% say they're somewhat confident. 0% are extremely confident. What do you think?
They're playing it safe.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
all right.
Yeah, kind of scary results there that only 46% are somewhat confident in PCI compliance. I'll hand it back to you, Vivian.
Sure, that's actually completely understandable. So let's proceed. So we've seen the statistics and reports and anecdotal comments about companies who were PCI compliant at the time of the breach. So this tells us that in order to secure your cardholder data or any sensitive data for that matter, Meeting your compliance benchmark, it's just the start. And it's actually wise to start looking at a data breach and security challenge in the context of risk. So what this means is that we need to start looking at the issue of, preventing, perpetrators from accessing your cardholder data by looking at it in the following dimensions. So first of all, you need to understand what are your high value assets. So for PCI, obviously it's your cardholder data, including the compute, the network, the storage, other resources that you really need to, to manage payment transactions. And then in addition to this, understanding, what are the legitimate connections and data flows to support these transactions. Second, it's understanding, your exposure and your vulnerabilities. What are the vulnerabilities in your environment today? Which of those vulnerabilities can be exploited by bad actors to exploit your cardholder data? And the third one, which is, I think, fairly new for a lot of organizations, is really putting yourself in the mindset of your adversary, understanding who are they? Are they state actors, or are they something else? Are they like criminal organizations? What are their motivations? What are their capabilities to exploit vulnerabilities? And then once you have these three components, then you can start assessing for their impact. So you determine in terms of combining, information about the bad actors, what they know about your app, the assets that they're trying to target, your exposure and your vulnerabilities, how would these bad actors leverage these their capabilities to execute the perfect breach? Once you have that understanding, this analysis will help you plan and deploy your risk mitigation strategies and, of course, assign resources accordingly. And the thing to keep in mind is this is very much a very iterative approach. So let's talk a little bit about how you could understand your adversary. So if you have a PCI program, then you know that you already have a method for understanding your high value assets. In this case, your cardholder data and your payment systems. You obviously also have your data flow diagrams because you use this information to effectively scope what is defined as your CDE, and you use this to design your segmentation plan. You also have a vulnerability management program, your secure application development, and change control programs. So you can programmatically understand, what are your exposures, and you can manage these exposures. So let's talk about this third component of Risk 101, which is, know your enemy, know your adversary. And it turns out there are a number of useful frameworks and taxonomies that you can use to actually model your adversary and their behavior. And I'm going to mention a couple of these in this section. So there's a cyber kill chain, which is the most famous one, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. And this is specifically a model for identifying and ultimately preventing what they call cyber intrusions activity. The second one is the MITRE attack framework, which I will go to in more detail in subsequent sections. The third one is the diamond model, which is also pretty valuable if you're looking to do intrusion analysis. And the fourth one is called STIX, which stands for Structured Threat Intel, Threat Information Expression. So this is slightly different in the sense that its primary purpose is to be used as a common taxonomy so that different organizations trying to report on indicators can share that information. And so in this case, they refer to the adversary as a threat actor. So now let's go a little bit into the MITRE attack framework, just as a recap. So as most of you already know, MITRE attack is a global knowledge of adversary tactics and techniques. And so a lot of this is based on real world observations. And if you go to the mitreattack.org website, you will actually see a matrix which identifies 13 different tactics. And then under each tactic, you will see a variety of techniques that bad actors or your adversaries will use to penetrate their targets. You can also view it in the context of looking at the most common platforms, including mobile. So the MITRE attack is really helpful in helping you understand, what is your security risk against a known adversarial behavior. And it's very useful in terms of identifying your gaps. So then you can plan and you can prioritize your security improvements. You can also use it to determine if your defenses and your compliance controls are working as expected. The one thing to keep in mind is this framework is not a linear process. So once you know your assets, you know your exposures and your vulnerabilities, you can refer to the matrix to determine, how a bad actor can potentially use one of these tactics and techniques to, to penetrate your environment. So let's look at the lateral movement attack technique. So for example, which is the lateral movement box. Here, if you click on that box, which is the lateral movement tactic, you'll be able to see a detailed description of the tactic, and then underneath that, the different techniques. And then when you select a particular technique, for example, you'll also be able to see a detailed description of a technique, including examples in terms of how this was used by adversaries in the real world. But most important, which is really valuable for everyone, MITRE attack also provides in-depth guidance in terms of how to mitigate and how to detect for potential abuse. So as I mentioned earlier, this is really helpful in terms of understanding if your compliance controls around mitigation and detection are actually sufficient. And then also it helps you identify critical gaps in your detection and risk mitigation capabilities. So let's look at this in the real world, and let's look at a hypothetical retailer or hotel chain or restaurant chain and see how they could potentially use the MITRE attack framework to secure their environment against Fin7 attacks. I'm sure a lot of you know that Fin7 is an Eastern European criminal organization. They've been very successful in targeting U.S. companies, particularly in the gaming, hospitality, entertainment industry. It was reported that they've stolen over 15 million credit card information and that they've averaged at some point like over $50 million per month on stolen credit card information. So Carbon Spider is the variant of the malware that's being used to target retail, hospitality, and gaming companies. And so in this scenario, if you're a retailer or hotel chain, you already know two things: your high value assets, which is your customer credit card information and where it's located, so a description of your CDE. You also know what your exposure and your vulnerabilities are in your environment. So by referencing the MITRE attack framework and also published information about Fin7's mode of operation, as a retailer or hotel chain security practitioner, you know that a typical attack would look like this. Initial access, it will start with either spear phishing or social engineering one of the employees from those target companies so that then they can introduce the initial malware into the environment. And then once the malicious payload is inside the network, it would connect to Fin7 to download additional malware, which then starts scanning the network to find a path to your payment systems, conducts surveillance, it captures credentials, it gains elevated network access, locate the point of sale systems, and eventually steal your credit card number. So in the scenario that I just described, I called out two tactics and techniques. The typical attack that starts with initial access, using spear phishing, and then moving to lateral movement using either application deployment or exploitation of remote services as some of their techniques. So MITRE offers very significant guidance around mitigation and remediation. So a retailer or a hotel organization, knowing this information, will use this to evaluate if their current preventative controls, as well as any indicators that they use to detect for potential attack, whether it's defined by their PCI or other security program, is effective and sufficient. And if there are gaps, they can use this to plan their either risk mitigation or remediation plans. So if you read all the reports and blogs that dive deep into the details of these different attacks, it turns out that the most common denominator of most major PCI breaches, including the Fin7 example that I just described, and prior to this, is how the adversary moves laterally within the enterprise. So this is known in MITRE as lateral movement. So here, a bad actor will target seemingly low-value systems like spear phishing, using spear phishing, for example, and then spreads the malware laterally across the data center to find a route that would allow them to compromise the cardholder data environment. And once they reach, the target system, which is the credit card data, then they either copy or exfiltrate the payment information. So what you're seeing here is a very oversimplified diagram of the breaches that have made the news in the last few years. But this is the overarching pattern that investigators and security researchers continue to see again and again. So in the next section, we will discuss what organizations can do to protect their environment against lateral movement attack techniques. So most enterprises have flat networks. So flat network. So a fundamental strategy to mitigating a lateral movement attack is really to restrict, a bad actor's ability to traverse the network. And they do this by compartmentalizing the environment. The best way to explain this approach is to use the analogy of a submarine. So if you've seen how submarines are constructed, there's an outer, very robust shell which needs to protect the overall submarine from a variety of hazards, most notably, water at very high pressures. And then within that outer shell, a submarine is separated out into several components, or which you call a bulkhead. So that way, if there is a hole in one part of the submarine and water starts coming in, each compartment is watertight, so preventing the water from filling out the rest of the compartments and eventually sinking the submarine into the bottom of the ocean. So if you look at this in the context of an enterprise environment, you want to be able to isolate and segment applications or even entire environments like your CDE to control communications in and out of that environment. This is known as the least privilege or zero trust security approach. And this approach helps you contain the attack surface. So that way, even if your perimeter defenses are breached, you're still able to effectively restrict the movement of a bad actor. And this is what microsegmentation is all about. So it turns out that solving for lateral movement is a lot easier said than done. And why is that? Because a typical organization is complex. So, if you're a typical organization, you probably have applications running across multiple workloads, which could include a combination of mixed mode VMs, multi-cloud, heterogeneous OS platforms. And then for larger organizations, some of these applications may be striped across multiple data centers. So trying to map in real-time connections and data flows of your CDE connections and non-CDE connections, it would probably look like this. So here we have, what we're showing, and this is from our application, which we call the Illumination Application Dependency Map. You are seeing the connections and flows, over 200,000 flows across 100 workloads. So pretty complex. Many of you will probably already say, but I already have perimeter defenses. PCI Compliance has been around for at least 10 years. The challenge and need to secure your crown jewel applications like your cardholder data environment, it's not new, nor is the idea of segmenting applications or environments. Organizations have been, solving segmentation with firewalls at the perimeter, ACLs and routers at the intersection of the networks, and then using switches to create VLANs within a network. So many of you will ask, what's changed? Why would I need to review my current segmentation approaches? And our answer is a lot has changed. And you already know this. I'm already stating the obvious. So first, your data center environments, they're more dynamic. You have cloud, you have VMs, you're experimenting with containers and microservices. Maybe you're looking at increased automation for IT ops. You're looking at immutable infrastructure. So as a result, your workload environment is very dynamic. Your perimeter is very porous. So this makes visibility, knowing what's in scope, knowing that your scope's up to date, keeping your firewall rules up to date, it's a lot more difficult with legacy approaches. And then secondly, your adversaries continue to develop new tactics and techniques. So it's smarter to assume that your perimeter is compromised and then focus on how to contain or prevent your bad actors from exploring or wreaking havoc into your environment. So if you try to use segmentation the old way, using legacy approaches while your data center environment is evolving, you're probably going to observe the following limitations. First, a lot of these methods really don't provide visibility in terms of how applications are talking to each other, especially if you have a need to see this in real time. Then there's no way for you to verify in quickly if these connections and applications are actually current and legitimate. Second, there's increased automation in the software development lifecycle, and these demands that security provisioning is tightly coupled with the deployment and release cycles. You won't have 4 hours to change one firewall rule just because you're deploying a new application. You need to be a lot quicker than that and be tightly integrated with the development and release cycles. Thirdly, keeping track of changes and updating firewalls, it's time consuming. It doesn't really scale. It could lead to misconfiguration and broken application and outages. Fourth, there's a lot of legacy segmentation approaches where you're required to either reroute or re-architect your networks or route traffic through certain choke points. And this obviously has adverse impact on performance, as well as it might incur additional overheads. And then fifth, if the policies are static and you have to update manually, it doesn't really scale very well, especially as your IT operations environment is becoming more and more automated. And then finally, there are areas where your data center firewalls aren't really able to go. So moving to the cloud, for example, especially to public clouds. So when you start to see all of these challenges in your data center, or even if your future state of the data center, you're anticipating increased use of your cloud resources, containers, or if you're moving into a DevOps infrastructure, you'll need to start considering and evaluating your segmentation approaches. So microsegmentation, we believe, is a foundational component for limiting the mobility of bad actors inside your network. And there are several approaches for doing this. Sorry, I lost my presentation. So first of all, if you're segmenting your network using the network infrastructure, you're using data center firewalls and ACLs. That's on the left-hand side. This is a legacy model, and it's primarily been intended to optimize productivity and network performance. The challenge here is, it doesn't really provide a lot of application visibility. We've mentioned the challenges of doing this in cloud environments, and since it could involve re-architecting your network, it could be expensive. The second approach is doing segmentation at the hypervisor layer. And the challenge here is a lot of these solutions tend to be very vendor specific. And it may also have either limited cloud and container support and no coverage for bare metals, which means that, if your traffic crosses across, your on-prem physical servers with your with your VMs and your cloud, how many consoles do you have to log into in order to have full visibility and manage your segmentation? And then the last approach is looking at segmentation at the workload. Here, you're leveraging the native stateful firewall that's already in the OS. And this is sometimes referred to as host-based microsegmentation. So the challenge here is, you will be deploying an agent, which really throws off some individuals. But arguably, if you do deploy the agent, this is going to be the most important agent that you'll have in your enterprise. So looking at microsegmentation, it's really an effective approach to ring fence your cardholder data environment. And if you do this effectively, you're not only going to be able to meet your PCI requirements, you'll actually be able to enhance your protection against lateral movement attack techniques. So if you are looking for a microsegmentation solution, these are some of the capabilities or must-have requirements that we recommend you consider. First of all, having the ability to provide a single control plane for global visibility as well as to centrally manage policies across, very heterogeneous platforms and mixed mode environments. So it's on-prem, it's physical, it's virtual servers, or it could be your public and your private cloud. The second one is, having the ability to provide real-time visibility into the application flows and dependencies, because this will inform your policy, and also it will help you decide how do you want to restrict movements between and across apps and workloads. Third is, have the ability to import other contextual information like threat intel or vulnerability information. So remember, what we mentioned earlier about thinking like an adversary. So you want to have the ability so that you can understand based on the asset that I want to target or that I have, as well as, based on information that I have on the vulnerabilities in my environment. If I was an adversary, how would I move from host to host so I can get to my target asset? In this case, the cardholder data. Fourth is, have the ability to automate policy creation based on historical traffic flows, and also and adopt firewall rules. So that way, as the workload changes, for example, migrating to a new data center, security is consistently enforced, and it's recalculated based on the environment changes, but then the policies are consistently enforced. And then the other thing is also around making sure that, we call this the crawl, walk, run. Have the ability to model and build out your policies, test it before you go into full enforcement. So that way you can make sure you're not breaking any applications. And then lastly, look at solutions that will give you the ability to select and apply the right level of segmentation granularity. So you may want to start with coarse-grained segmentation, for example, to segment out specific environments like your test dev op, your test dev versus your cardholder data environment. But then there might be specific instances, like for example, where you would want to do process level segmentation as a compensating control. So a lot of these is going to be driven by business as well as security context, but you would want a solution that would give you the ability to control the level of segmentation granularity that you want to apply. And so lastly, just a little bit of a closing advice in terms of our PCI success. Visibility and scope is really important. So this means that, focus on identifying where your cardholder data resides, making sure that you have your PCI data flows, and ideally give, PCI data flows that are actually allows you to have visibility in real time. Also making sure that you understand which systems are connected to and which are supporting systems, and also identify what systems are out of scope that could potentially connect with your CDA system. So a lot of these guidance is, you'll find this in the PCI guidance around scoping and segmentation. So, I would encourage you to read that particular document. And then the second one is really taking a risk-based approach as opposed to just doing the compliance checklist. So that means looking at your assets, looking at your exposure and your vulnerability, thinking like an adversary, and then, based on that, doing your impact analysis to identify how an adversary could potentially attack your environment, and then evaluate whether your defenses as well as your compliance controls are working the way they're supposed to. And then, it's the classic advice around segmenting in phases, crawl, walk, run, as we always say. So test, build, and then enforce. And then lastly, build relationships across your application owners, security, compliance, and infrastructure ops. So what we've found is, like with a lot of the most successful organizations, they actually let the application owners verify and define what the policies are, as well as verify whether the applications and connections are legitimate. But then having said that, the provisioning of security is actually still being done by the security groups. So, fostering the trust, fostering that that collaboration, but still have the ability to enforce segregation of duties as you're doing these process. This concludes my presentation, so thank you very much for your time.
Great presentation, Vivian. Lots of really great advice in there. Thank you, and I really enjoyed the closing advice there. That's very actionable. So now it's time to do our prize giveaway before we jump into our Q&A session. If you have a question about PCI, about microsegmentation, thinking about implementing it, but you're just not sure exactly how it works or why you should do it, now's the time to get those questions in because the Q&A session is coming up. So the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card is Henry Cheng from California. Congratulations to Henry.
Congratulations.
And now let's talk about some of these questions that have been coming in. Vivian, go ahead and, if you don't mind, move on to that last slide there because I want to leave that up because I know there's a lot of people. Yes. I know there's a lot of people out there who want to learn more, who might be interested in the Illumio test drive, and that's the URL right there on the screen. We'll leave that up while we answer some of these questions. It's illumio.com/test drive. So,
yes, so yeah, we actually encourage you to check this out because this will give you a chance to, deploy and the VEN in, a test environment and then you can see how policies are created. You won't be able to do full enforcement, but you can build and you can test.
Okay. Very nice. Yeah, I bet you could learn a lot from just going through that test drive and seeing what type of traffic is happening on the core of the network.
Exactly.
And then, yeah. So one question that came in here, they're asking about when you go to implement microsegmentation, there's a lot of rules to create. Is there some way to test those rules before you essentially flip the switch?
Yes, yeah. So the way we do it with Illumio, because we collect, when the product is initially deployed or the VENs are initially deployed in the customer environment, it collects a lot of the telemetry information. And so this telemetry information is actually used to make recommendations in terms of what should be the appropriate firewall rules based on the application's behavior. And so this is where, the application owner comes in, looks at it and says, yeah, this looks normal, I agree with that. Or you might say, no, I don't agree with that. That's actually not a legitimate traffic, and they could say that shouldn't happen. So with Illumio, you can actually, want to make the initial recommendations in terms of what are the microsegmentation policies and the firewall rules. Then you can start testing it. So you start with building to validate if the traffic is legitimate, and also to validate if there are some connections that should have microsegmentation enforced. Once you've done that, you can put it into test mode. So this allows you to see and make sure that you're not breaking any applications before you go into full enforcement.
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, because I know a lot of people, they don't use host-based firewalls because they just don't know what ports to open up. And when with production applications, that's scary. You can't, accidentally close off network traffic. So that's a very important part to me of the Illumio solution, is where you get illuminated. I like that term that y'all use, to see what's happening really on the network before you implement microsegmentation. So
yeah, and the visibility is in real time because the VENs are constantly communicating with the PCE.
That's nice. Yeah, it's not an after the fact report that you get later. So one of the questions that came in here, they're asking, with companies who are PCI compliant, getting breached, what's the most common reason for that? Why does that happen in your opinion?
Yeah, so according to the payment card, the Verizon payment security report, and even other either security blogs, there's a couple of common reasons why they fail, even if they're PCI compliant. The first one is really around how they've scoped what is their CDE. As you all know, credit card data is stored in the most random places, and sometimes companies fail to account for that. So that's one. The second one is really around, most companies have flat networks, and then they rely primarily on, perimeter defenses. But once a malware is introduced inside your environment, via spear phishing or some other method, once they're inside your flat network, they're free to roam around and propagate and proceed to the next stage of their attack. And then lastly, it's around change controls. So one of the requirements with PCI for firewall is, whenever your environment changes, you're actually supposed to evaluate and update your firewall rules if needed. But sometimes firewall rules are not updated in time.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Another question here that came in, they're asking, how do I reconcile the differences between PCI compliance requirements and the MITRE attack framework?
Sure. Yeah. So both actually, so it's useful to look at it in the context of risk. So let's start with like assets. So both PCI compliance requirements as well as the MITRE attack framework, they both start with, know your assets, know your high value systems, know your high value targets, where it's located, what are the relationships, and then the dependencies. And this is, if you look at the PCI scoping guide, they've got very good instructions in terms of how you go about doing this. The second part is really around exposure. So PCI requires a solid vulnerability management program as one of its goals. So that's actually requirement 5 as well as requirement 6. And then with MITRE, MITRE has this database of potential techniques that adversaries could use. And then they also provide detailed guidance on how to mitigate and what metrics to collect so that they are able to enable detection. So the way you reconcile this is, you look at your compliance controls based on on PCI and then the benchmark, and then compare that against MITRE's recommendations for remediation, mitigation and detection, and evaluate, are your defenses doing what it's supposed to do, or do you have gaps?
Okay, that's great advice. And then another question here, can you kind of sum up the benefits of host-based microsegmentation again?
Sure, yeah. So, well, first of all, like with host-based microsegmentation, the most important thing is you already have all the enforcement points that you have in your host. So if you're using Windows, it's the Windows filtering platform. In Linux, it's IP tables. For load balancers and switches, it's ACLs for your cloud security groups. You can leverage your host not just as your enforcement point, but it's also as your sensor because you have all this traffic and telemetry data. So you can use this to enable like real-time visibility, know that your application is behaving normally, or if there's any anomalous behavior, which could be an indicator of a potential attack or an ongoing attack. The third one is, since you have your native enforcement points, you can program the native stateful firewalls in each host, so you don't have to re-architect your network and your firewalls. And as we all know, re-architecting a network and reprogramming your firewall rules, it can be costly, it can be complex, especially as your environment continues to scale. And then lastly, there are areas where it's really expensive to install a data center firewall. So for example, you can't really install a firewall for every VLAN, and then also your firewalls can't go into a public cloud. So if you have a very mixed environment and there's traffic going back and forth between your public cloud as well as your on-prem data centers, it becomes a very expensive exercise to manage this.
Okay. And then another question, kind of a direct question here. They're asking, if PCI doesn't require microsegmentation, then why should we do it?
Yeah, so if you look at requirement 1, it corrects, it says it focuses on the correct use of firewalls not only between internal and external traffic, but also lateral traffic inside the network. But a lot of organizations have flat networks. And then in many instances, their environments are also becoming more porous because they're moving to the cloud. They're doing a lot more virtualized environments. They're doing DevOps. They're experimenting with containers and microservices. So if you combine these two together, this is a reason why you may have companies that are PCI certified, but they still have the data breaches because they have increased porosity in their environment because they're moving into the cloud and other newer technologies, but they're still using traditional approaches to segment their environment, especially if their environment is flat.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's absolutely the best way to secure your network. Well, let's see. It looks like that's all the questions that have come in. We've covered everything, and this has been a really great event. Why don't we give back a few minutes to our attendees today? I really appreciate your presentation today, Vivian.
Thank you, David. It's nice chatting with you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us on the event today. If you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to schedule a demo or run the test drive of the Illumio solution on your own network, visit illumio.com/TD for test drive, or click the link that I posted there in the chat, and you can sign up for that test drive today and ensure that your network is not only more PCI compliant, but also secure. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great day. I hope you enjoyed the event. See you on the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.